Hollywood was never what it appeared to be. Beneath the glamour, the premieres, the perfume of cigarettes and champagne, there were real men, powerful, tortured, celebrated, who came home at night to women who kneeled at the foot of their beds and prayed. Women who wore crosses, not diamonds. Women who loved God more than they loved the spotlight. And in some cases, those women were the only thing holding these men together. Tonight, we pull back the golden curtain on 10 of Hollywood's greatest stars and the devout Catholic wives the world never truly knew. Number 1 alone will change everything you thought you knew about old Hollywood. Gary Cooper. He was the all-American hero. Tall, quiet, with that slow drawl and those steel blue eyes that made women forget their own names. Gary Cooper was the face of strength in Hollywood, a man who played sheriffs and soldiers and men of unshakable principle. But behind the cameras, the truth was far more complicated. For years, Cooper lived a life that was, by any moral measure, reckless. Affairs, including a notorious relationship with Clara Bow that burned bright and scandalous across the tabloids. A brief, tempestuous romance with Marlene Dietrich. A reputation as a man who took what he wanted and answered to no one. And then came Veronica Balfe. She was young, beautiful, from a wealthy New York family. And she was a woman of deep, uncompromising Catholic faith. They married in 1933, and from the moment Veronica entered his life, everything shifted. She didn't chase the spotlight. She didn't care for the parties or the politics of Hollywood society. She cared about her faith, her family, and the quiet dignity of a life lived with intention. Cooper resisted her world for years. He was not a religious man, and those who knew him said he sometimes found her devotion quietly intimidating. But what happened in his final years shocked even his closest friends. As Cooper lay dying of cancer in 1961, he converted to Catholicism, privately, sincerely, in the presence of a priest. Many believed it was Veronica's decades of quiet faith that finally reached him. She never pressured him. She simply lived her belief every single day. And in the end, it was enough. Gary Cooper, the man who stared down villains on screen without flinching, found peace in a faith he once kept at arm's length, and the woman who guided him there never asked for a single headline. Bing Crosby. There are voices that define an era, and then there is Bing Crosby. Warm, effortless, the kind of voice that felt like it was coming from inside your own chest. He was the best-selling recording artist of the 20th century. He was Father O'Malley in Going My Way. He was Christmas itself for an entire generation. And his Catholic faith was not a performance. It was bone-deep, inherited, the kind that comes from Irish Catholic parents who treated the church not as a Sunday obligation, but as the very structure of life. His first wife, Dixie Lee, was the woman who anchored his early Hollywood years. She had converted to Catholicism before their marriage, and that conversion was not a casual gesture. Dixie took her new faith seriously, deeply, privately seriously. She raised their 4 sons within the church and maintained her spiritual life even as her own Hollywood career faded and her personal struggles with alcoholism grew darker and more consuming. Fans had no idea what was really happening behind those pristine holiday specials. While Crosby crooned about white Christmases and sleigh bells, Dixie was fighting battles that no one outside their household fully understood. She died of cancer in 1952, and those who witnessed Crosby in the aftermath described a man hollowed out with grief. He later remarried Catherine Grant, another Catholic woman, decades his junior, and the faith remained the thread running through every chapter of his life. But it was Dixie, quiet and suffering and faithful, who shaped the spiritual gravity of his home. The real Bing Crosby was never quite as cheerful as the music suggested. And this was only the beginning. Pat O'Brien. You may not know his name the way you know Gable or Grant, but in the 1930s, Pat O'Brien was everywhere. He was Warner Brothers' go-to actor for priests, cops, and tough-talking Irishmen, roles he played with such natural authority that audiences simply assumed he was exactly that in real life. And the truth is, he nearly was. Born in Milwaukee to Irish Catholic parents, O'Brien never drifted far from the church the way so many of his peers did when the money and the fame started arriving. He brought that same faith into his marriage to Eloise Taylor, whom he wed in 1931. Eloise was a woman of genuine devotion, quiet and steadfast, the kind of Catholic who didn't speak much about her faith because she didn't feel the need to. It was simply visible in how she lived. Their marriage lasted over 50 years, a near miracle in an industry where marriages dissolved faster than morning fog over the Pacific. In an era when Hollywood's casting couches and late-night studio parties made faithfulness seem almost quaint, the O'Briens were a quiet anomaly. Pat later wrote in his autobiography that Eloise was the conscience he returned to after every role, every tour, every rowdy night out with his famous circle of friends, which included a young Ronald Reagan, James Cagney, and Spencer Tracy. Their shared faith was not theatrical. It was private, lived, and lasting. In an industry that chewed through marriages without apology, Pat O'Brien and his devout wife stood apart, and almost no one noticed. Spencer Tracy. No conversation about Hollywood and faith can go very far before arriving at Spencer Tracy, because Tracy is the great contradiction. He was perhaps the finest actor of the studio era, a man who made performing look as natural as breathing. He was also a lifelong Catholic who never divorced his wife, Louise, despite spending decades in one of Hollywood's most publicized love affairs with Katharine Hepburn. Louise Tracy was not simply a Catholic wife. She was a force. When their son John was born deaf in 1924, Louise threw herself into the cause of deaf education with a ferocity that defined the rest of her life. She founded the John Tracy Clinic, which provided oral education for deaf children around the world and helped families who had no other resources. She did this while her husband was making films, attending premieres, and spending his private hours with another woman. And she did not leave. That decision was not weakness. Those who knew Louise Tracy described it as a profound moral and spiritual choice, rooted entirely in her Catholic belief in the indissolubility of marriage. Tracy himself never sought a divorce. He was tormented by his double life. A man who drank to escape the guilt, who suffered depressive episodes, who once confessed to a friend that he knew exactly what he was and hated himself for it. When Tracy died in 1967, just 17 days after completing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Louise was there. Hepburn was not. The church, in the end, had held what the cameras never could. James Cagney. He was the original tough guy, that fast-talking, electric, unpredictable force of nature who redefined what it meant to be dangerous on screen. James Cagney could make your heart race with a glance. Off-screen, he was a different kind of man entirely. Disciplined, private, loyal, and deeply shaped by his Catholic roots and the woman he married at 23 years old. Frances Vernon, known to everyone as Billy, was James Cagney's wife for 64 years. 64 years. In Hollywood, she was a woman of quiet, unassuming Catholic faith who had no particular love for Hollywood glamour and no desire to compete with it. When Cagney's career exploded in the early 30s, when he became one of the biggest stars in the world, Billy didn't change. She kept the home. She kept the faith. She kept him tethered to something real when the industry would have been happy to pull him apart. Cagney himself remained a Catholic throughout his life. Though his relationship with the church was not without complexity, he had been raised in a rough section of Manhattan's Lower East Side, and his early years were not exactly marked by piety. But the older he got, the quieter he became, and the more clearly the values he'd absorbed as a child in that Irish Catholic household came back into focus. He left Hollywood behind in the 1960s, retreated to his farm in upstate New York with Billy, and simply lived. No memoirs, no tell-alls, no scandals, just a man and the woman he had chosen before the fame arrived, and never once replaced. What you're about to hear next might be the most surprising story in this entire list. Don Ameche. He was elegance personified. Don Ameche possessed a kind of old-world charm that made every role feel like he was doing you a personal favor by showing up. He played Alexander Graham Bell. He played in romantic comedies opposite Gene Tierney and Alice Faye. And later, shockingly, he reinvented himself in the 1980s and won an Academy Award for Cocoon at the age of 77. But beneath all of that charm and longevity was something most of his fans never thought to look for: an iron devotion to Catholicism and a marriage built entirely on it. Ameche married Honorée Prendergast in 1932, and together they had 6 children. Honorée was a practicing Catholic who was not interested in the theater of Hollywood life. She was interested in her family, her faith, and raising 6 children with an actual moral foundation. By Hollywood standards, this was practically eccentric. Amish himself was known throughout the industry as a practicing Catholic of unusual commitment. He attended daily Mass. He was involved in Catholic charitable organizations, and he was almost aggressive in his refusal to let the industry's social expectations override his private convictions. In an era when leading men were expected to be photographed at Ciro's and Macambo with starlets on their arms, Don Amish was home with his wife and children. His faith cost him nothing professionally. If anything, it seemed to give him an equanimity that served him right through his late career comeback. He and Honoré remained married until her death in 1986, after 54 years together. It was the kind of story Hollywood told on screen, but rarely lived. Rosalind Russell. She played every kind of woman on screen: the wisecracking newspaper reporter, the scheming socialite, the heartbroken mother. Rosalind Russell was one of the most versatile actresses of her generation, and she carried herself with a confidence that made lesser performers nervous just being in the same room. What most people didn't know was that her Catholic faith was not a background detail. It was central to everything. Born into a large Irish Catholic family in Connecticut, Russell grew up in the church and never left it, not even when Hollywood offered every conceivable temptation to look the other way. In 1941, she married Frederick Brisson, a Danish-born producer whose faith was not Catholic, but who understood, genuinely understood, that marrying Rosalind meant marrying her entire spiritual framework. They remained married until her death in 1976. But the story doesn't stop at a long marriage. In her later years, Russell developed crippling rheumatoid arthritis, a disease that progressively robbed her of the physical expressiveness that had been her greatest instrument as a performer. Fans had no idea what was really happening behind those magazine covers and charity galas. She was in constant, significant pain, and she handled it the way she handled everything, with her faith intact and her sense of humor sharper than ever. She became a prominent advocate for arthritis research and established a foundation in her name. The church gave her a framework for suffering, and she used it. Rosalind Russell never played the victim, not on screen, not off it. Ricardo Montalban. Long before he was Khan, long before the white suit and the fantasy island, Ricardo Montalban was something Hollywood didn't quite know what to do with. A Mexican actor of genuine sophistication and classical training who refused to be made smaller than he was. He arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1940s, handsome enough to make the cameras forget themselves, and he built a career against the grain of an industry that wanted him in bandoliers and sombreros. But the most important thing Ricardo Montalban brought from Mexico was not his accent or his training. It was his faith. He was a profoundly devout Catholic, and in 1944, he married Georgiana Young, the sister of actress Loretta Young, who was herself a woman of serious Catholic conviction. The Young family was famously Catholic in Hollywood, and Georgiana carried that identity not as a social credential, but as a genuine commitment. Together, she and Ricardo raised 4 children within the church and built a private life that stood almost entirely outside the Hollywood machinery. Montalban co-founded the National Hispanic Media Coalition and used his platform consistently for advocacy, but he also spoke openly, more openly than almost anyone in his era, about the role of his Catholic faith in sustaining him through the years when the industry was happy to offer him work, but not respect. When Georgiana died in 2007 after 63 years of marriage, Montalban was devastated in a way that those around him said he never truly recovered from. He passed away 2 years later, together until the very end, and guided, every step of the way, by something far older than Hollywood. Loretta Young. Here the story takes a different shape, because Loretta Young was not only the wife in this story. She was one of Hollywood's great actresses and one of its most publicly, sometimes controversially, devout Catholics. And her life, examined honestly, is one of the most dramatic intersections of faith, scandal, and survival in the history of the industry. Young married 3 times. Her second husband, Tom Lewis, was a radio and television producer, and their marriage, though it eventually ended, was conducted entirely within the Catholic framework that Loretta insisted upon. But what defined Loretta Young's relationship with faith was not her marriages. It was the scandal she carried for decades. In 1935, she reportedly became pregnant following an encounter with Clark Gable during the filming of The Call of the Wild. The child, a daughter named Judy, was later quietly adopted by Young in a story that allowed her to raise her own daughter while protecting her public image and, crucially, maintaining her standing as a public Catholic. The lengths she went to in order to reconcile her faith with the reality of her situation were extraordinary, and the secret was kept for decades. When Judy Lewis eventually wrote her memoir and confirmed what many had suspected, it reframed everything. Loretta Young had built her entire public persona on Catholic virtue, and that virtue was real, but so was the secret. She went to confession. She did penance. She never fully stopped believing. That tension between sin and grace, between public image and private truth, is perhaps the most Catholic story Hollywood ever produced, even if it took 50 years for anyone to tell it honestly. John Ford. And we arrive, finally, at John Ford, because no list of Hollywood, faith, and marriage is complete without the man who made the West into a cathedral. John Ford directed more great American films than any director before or since. The Grapes of Wrath, The Quiet Man, How Green Was My Valley, Stagecoach, The Searchers. He shaped the visual language of American cinema with the same authority that a painter shapes light, and underneath all of it, like bedrock beneath a landscape, was his Irish Catholic soul. Ford was not a gentleman. He was tyrannical on set, cruel to actors he respected and occasionally kind to those he didn't, given to drink, prone to episodes of Black Depression that shut him away from the world for days. What you're about to hear next is rarely discussed, even by film historians. His wife, Mary McBride Smith, who went by Mary Ford for the rest of her life, was an Episcopalian who converted to Catholicism before their marriage in 1920. That conversion was not theatrical. Mary Ford was a deeply serious woman who became deeply serious about her new faith, and she held the domestic center of their lives together for over 50 years of a marriage that was tested constantly by Ford's demons and his absences and his towering, self-destructive genius. She outlived him. She was present at the end, as she had been present at almost every significant moment in between. John Ford could compose a frame that made grown men weep, but he could never quite organize his own soul the way Mary quietly organized his life. The films survive. The faith sustained them. And the woman who kept the candle burning never once asked to be in the frame.